So, hello everyone. Thank you for zooming in today. Before I introduce Palden, our speaker, I have a couple of very quick announcements. Our Portraits, Creatures Great or Small show is up and running at Glenview Mansion. It is beautiful. Lisa, thank you for curating it. It just looks great. It will be up until February 16th. So please see it. Do yourself a favor. Following this show is a group of artists that are members of the Rockville Art League called the Colorists. And they have a show that opens on February 25th, and it will be up through April 5th. 6 local artists, Holly Bueller, Sandra Fritter, Joni Grosfeld, Jean Powell, Penny Smith, and Kathleen Zyfan. All fantastic artists. They applied with the city of Rockville on their own, and they were granted a show, and I can't wait to see it. A couple of notes about Zoom, and you've heard all of these notes before, but I need to repeat it. If you're just listening in or watching, please keep yourself on mute. Palden has asked that if people on the Zoom could type in their questions in the chat feature. Lisa will be looking at that, throughout the evening, and will share some of those questions or comments that she sees on chat with Palden, and then he'll be able to answer that. Now I'd like to introduce Palden. As most of you know, or hopefully know, Palden was the judge of our juried member show this December. And we had such positive feedback that I reached out after that show to see if Palden would be interested in presenting to our group, and thank goodness he was. He's a wonderful artist. He has his BFA from the School of Art Institute in Chicago. He then continued his studies at the Art Students League in New York. He teaches at MICA. He teaches at the Zoll Studio School of Fine Arts. And thank you, Palden, for presenting to us. So many of our members wanted to see a little bit more about your work, and then you've got a presentation for us. So without further ado, Palden, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Patrick. And thank you, Lisa. Hello, everyone. I have had the honor of seeing a lot of your work, jurying and judging this past show. And so it's nice to see your faces here. I thought because we're all artists here, I would do a presentation where I'd briefly show examples of my own work, and then talk about an exercise and way of thinking that's really helped me in my pursuit to be a better representational painter. And so I've pre-recorded a sped up painting demonstration that in total, I've whittled it down to about 35 minutes. So that should give me a little time to talk about, show you some slides of my work, explain the basic idea of this exercise, and then to show the demonstration and just narrate through it. We can do this in kind of maybe not quite conversational manner, but like I said, if you want to weigh in with any questions, I'll just be talking, but please interject with any of your questions. I'll be happy to answer them as I go along. So we'll start off by sharing. Oh, please.
On the chat.
Sorry.
On the chat.
On the chat. Okay, we'll do it on the chat. So I'm going to start off by showing some of my work. So I'm going to share my screen here, and I was told that my website is down, which I'm sorry, that would be the best place to direct you, but I'll show you some of my just a slide of some of my personal work. I put this in for kind of fun. I've been making these book nooks, which are these little wall dioramas with lights inside for my kids' room. There's a little digital illustration of my daughter there on the right. So I thought I'd put that in there for variety. Some of the lunch notes that I do for them. It is a good opportunity to practice line work and a more cartoony style. But I mainly do oil painting, and I'll give you an overview of my work because I do try to work in all genres. I think really my pursuit in painting is to be as complete a painter as I can. I want to try different subjects and learn as much as I can about painting people, places, and things. And so the talk today is going to be specifically about simple setups, planar forms, and simple light scenarios. And these particular paintings are kind of an expression of uh, that idea extrapolated out. On the left, I've been doing a series of paintings of sidewalk chalk, and I've arranged them in a shadow box, and I paint them in a way that it sometimes seems to evoke the feeling of ruins of a lost civilization. So they're fun to paint. They're lighthearted, but they also have the strange kind of sad quality. On the right, I've painted what a lot of times is the backdrop to my domestic life, which is clothes piles. And I love painting them because of just the colors, their formal qualities. Um, and so I've done a series of those clothes piles recently, playing around with form juxtaposed up against flat backgrounds. This is a plaster cast. Some of you might know the plaster cast. It's a famous head of Voltaire. And somebody in the studio where I teach dropped this plaster cast of mine and it shattered. And I made it into a still life setup. This is a rather large painting. It's maybe 4 feet wide. And it's a representational painting, but I like the abstract qualities. And then I added in that magenta streak afterward and turned it into something like a landscape. I love painting natural objects. I love nature. I when I went to the Art Institute of Chicago, some of my favorite classes were in the illustration department, specifically natural history and scientific illustration, which were taught at the Field Museum, which is the Natural History Museum in Chicago. And we'd go to the research floor and get to work from bird specimens and bugs. And so since I've collected my own collection of a little bit of taxidermy, beetles, moths. The one on the left was painted of a bird mount in Philadelphia when I was doing the Wayne Plenar event. There were a couple of rainy days where I couldn't go outside, and so I painted this bird mount. Interestingly, in the bottom center, that bird is the now extinct passenger pigeon. So this mount was made maybe 100 years ago. So I was trying to pay tribute to that little fellow. And then on the right is a small painting on panel that I did of one of my insects. So I like painting things that are or were alive. I love painting flowers. There's one on the left that am working on, which is a painting of peonies. The one on the right is an alla prima painting of some peonies with the setup in front of me. Advertising. And I paint the figure. So when I went to the Art Students League, I mainly focused on figurative painting and portrait painting. So the painting on the left is rather large. It's about maybe 7 feet tall. And that one I did by doing a more sort of classical procedure where I did a preliminary drawing. I transferred it to a large panel. I did sort of limited color layer and then painted more colorfully on top. And I should say that most everything to this point that I've painted, that I've shown you, is done from life. So I am kind of a stickler from painting from life. I find that when I'm in the presence of the person or place or thing that I'm painting, I form a connection, and I feel like the resulting image is in my mind imbued with an experience, and that's part of the magic of painting to be. So when possible, I paint from life. For portrait commissions, which you're about to see, I will necessarily have to work from photos, but I don't have anything against using photo reference. It's just for me personally, I love painting from life. And then the painting on the right is a figure that I did in an open figure session that was maybe a 2 or 3 session painting. I love, again, painting people. Here are a couple of close-ups of people. On the right is a friend of mine who was the TA for my first semester teaching at MICA. So he was gracious enough to pose for me. That's part of a larger painting that's probably, 7 or 8 feet tall. And then on the left is a recent portrait commission of Patricia and her 2 doxies. So again, this is sort of a whirlwind tour of my work. I would refer you to my website if it wasn't down, but hopefully it will be back up soon. I do plein air painting. That's probably the latest addition to my, I guess, repertoire. The last, 15 years or so, I've made space for a couple of plein air events a year, usually Easton or Atlanta. This past year, I did Texas and Atlanta. On the left here is a scene from Baltimore County. It's the last light on creeping through this forest on my parents' property, which I was pretty happy with. I like working with being forced into the time constraints of plein air. I'm usually a more sort of methodical, more thoughtful, I think, a painter that likes to take my time. But plein air has been great for me because it forces me to work more intuitively in a quicker time frame. And on the right is a street corner in Atlanta.
Doing more of.
Hard to do on the winter.
Okay, so that is the overview of my work. And I'm going to try and find my cursor here. My cursor's gone missing. Oops, that's not mine. I wish that was mine. Huh. Okay. So now I am going to go on to the premise of the talk, which is simple forms and simple lighting scenarios. So here we are at the next. Does everyone see that? Simple planar form, simple lighting.
It's up and running.
Okay, great. This is a handout, instructional handout I did showing my general procedure from drawing to block in and then beyond. But one thing I've been interested in my adventures in painting, and I can't say I did go to art school, but I never got a formal sort of technical training, I feel like. The Art Students League in New York is a non-degree program. I studied with a couple individual teachers there, but it wasn't sort of a regimented program. At the Art Institute of Chicago, the emphasis was mainly on conceptual art, and I didn't get much of a foundation in representational painting. And so but I noticed that there's this vein that runs through art history of conceptualizing forms in a geometric planar fashion. And that's something I was always interested in. I never quite got. And so here I've included some images. We have sort of a famous planar head on the left. In the middle is Albrecht Dürer kind of wrestling with devising a system of breaking the head down into planar forms. A lot of us are familiar with on the right, Bridgman's sort of box and wedge conceptualization of the figure. And it intrigued me because historically, I'm a very perceptual painter. I sort of enter into painting trying to use the naive eye, trying to just deduce everything from observation. And so conceptualizing objects is something that was relatively new to me until maybe 15 years ago. Another painter who does this is Ewan Uglow, great British painter. And you can see he takes a geometric approach to things that are thought of usually as smooth and volumetric, pairs, figures. And one thing I like about it with this planar conceptualization is you really see with the junction of these planes, you can see that each plane has a very carefully considered subtle sort of tone and color shift. And I wanted some of that subtlety in my own work. Here are some other contemporary painters that I feel like are taking a planar approach to to round objects. Zoe Frank on the left, David Shavlino on the right. An egg is the epitome of a smoothly flowing volume, but here you can see it sort of hacked away at as if it's carved with it's sort of carved out of a chainsaw almost. A couple other examples are Sarah Sedgwick on the left, who's a great art educator. I've found her stuff on Instagram. And then Studio Escalier on the right. Very classic atelier, but here they've again created that geometric breakdown of the figure. So I thought, well, maybe I can recreate this in my studio. I'm not the first one to come up with this idea. I first saw these kind of planar blocks at Lee Boynton's studio, who's an Annapolis painter, who studied in sort of the Henchy Cape Cod style. And so I ended up just creating my own planar blocks. So on the top here, we have these blocks that I got cedar blocks and whittled them down, sanded them down into these planar objects. So I could actually see, I could create controlled experiments and paint from them in my own studio. So this is a kind of educational handout that I made, but the main purpose is just to show you that this is an assignment that's really helped me over the years. I refer my students to it. It's sort of a form of torture that I make my students partake in. And it's something that I absolutely learn from every time I do it. And I'll pull out these blocks, once or twice a year and work on them myself. And I've painted them in all sorts of light scenarios. I think they're ideal for seeing the simple workings of light on simple forms. And here I've got ones that I've done outside, in artificial light, natural light. One thing I really insist upon is controlling light. Really, when I paint all subjects, but especially when I paint still life, it's really half the battle. And so traditionally, Northlit studios were great artist light because ambient light is cut out from most directions, and then a single strong light source is isolated. And the northern facing sky doesn't have direct sunlight pouring in. It's exposed to the sort of the diffuse, consistent light of the sky for most of the day. So it's ideal painter's light. And it mimics sort of what studios in the atelier system of 18th and 19th century Europe used. The idea was that students would paint these casts, which are devoid of local color, set them up in a very controlled light scenario, usually just with black surroundings and a single light source, to see the basic workings of light on form and learning how to replicate that before going on to subsequently more complicated subjects and lighting scenarios. What I sometimes try and recreate is here we see, I believe it's, is it not Galileo's? Oh my gosh. I'm blanking out. Nostradamus? Is it Galileo's? Maybe Galileo's. I'm sorry, Galileo, if I'm misattributing this. Studies of the phases of the moon, which I think are just these beautifully sensitive, like artistic renditions of a scientific subject. But when I think of a controlled setup, I do think of the moon in the night sky, where this object is surrounded by the black vacuum of space and then hit to some degree by the primary source of light in our solar system. So it's very clear where the light and shadow is and where they separate. And the term is where the light and shadow separates on a heavenly body is a terminator. So when I try and set up a figure or a still life, I'm always trying to recreate a really strong light and shadow interplay. I feel like that is what, at the end of the day, reveals form. I do a demonstration for my class sometimes where I take black objects in a black shadow box, which look pretty much invisible. And then I take this fluorescent powder and I drizzle it slowly on top of these forms. And what that does is the powder will accumulate on those planes that face most up toward the sky, the same way snow would deposit on rock faces on a snowy day. And those planes of those rocks that face most perpendicular to the source of snow will accumulate the most snow, obviously. And as planes start to angle away, they might accumulate a little less. And then as they become more steep, they'll accumulate less. At a certain point, the snow will kind of glance off the sides. And then, of course, when you have undercuts, no snow will deposit at all. And that is an analogy that I'm constantly using when I paint subjects, except I'm using light as a stand-in for snow. Of course, light behaves more differently than matter. It's got a dual wave particle nature, but it's a great sort of analogy, I find, and makes sense of an infinitely complex visual world in which it's very hard to decipher what actually is going on. These are some experiments by my favorite painter, Abbott Henderson Thayer, but I'm not sure if that's going to be of relevance yet. Maybe we could talk about him later. And I'm going to go into my demonstration that I did of the blocks. Are there any notable questions? Is everything making sense so far? I feel like I'm hitting a lot of different subjects, but my hope is that it's somewhat coherent to this point.
It's completely coherent. Thank you.
Oh, good. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen of my video demonstration here. And I am going to view. Okay. Oops. That's not what I want to do. Hold, please. There we go. That'll work. Okay, so I start with a panning shot of my studio. I'm very fortunate to have a north-lit studio. And here I am showing one of my blocks that I'm setting up to paint. And here I'm demonstrating that the block is a very satisfying object, but when it is kind of infiltrated by ambient light, oftentimes we paint subjects that in themselves are interesting, but then when we put them in the wrong kind of lighting scenario, it muddles the form. So here I've put an example of a surface that kicks a lot of ambient light into those bottom planes, what should be shadowed planes of the object, and confuses the simple interplay of light and shadow on the object, and then drop the clip light coming in from the right, which sort of competes with the natural light coming from the left. And I feel like a lot of times we set ourselves up for success or failure in how we arrange our lighting scenario. And again, I am kind of insist on having simple objects, simple setups, especially for learning. So here I've set it in the shadow box to cut out a lot of the ambient light. I'm trying to quiet down the noise of the plywood background. I've put some coffee cans or objects to cast some shadow on the back wall. So we have the lit portion of the object juxtaposed up against a shadowed background, just little tricks to make things visually pop more. And I have started, just for illustration's sake, to show some options that you can start to create within this controlled setup. You can really see when you put this colored construction paper, you can see how especially a light or white object becomes almost a mirror that takes on the qualities of the light source and the ambient light or shadow. And you can see how the yellows kicks into that rightmost plane. Of course, the red is kicking into the bottom planes. This would happen on any object, even an object with strong local color, although oftentimes we wouldn't be able to observe it. So when I paint a landscape, I'm definitely thinking in terms of, well, what is the temperature of the light source? What is the temperature of the reflected light? What's happening in the shadow? And once I decipher that, unlock that rule, I know that that's enacting on all things in the landscape, and it gives me a clue as to what colors to make, a tree versus a rock versus the ground plane versus a far mountain. They're all abiding by the same rules, and that's what creates harmony in the painting and makes my job easier as an artist. So I've just showed a couple of scenarios of how you can play with kicking light around in these setups. And here I've made these primary colored blocks, but you can see how, again, the reflected light sort of alters the temperature of all these objects. And how all these I consider sort of visual analogies for objects that you might paint in a still life. I think of the yellow one as a lemon, for instance. So here's my setup. And here I'll just begin narrating the process. I planned maybe to go in directly with color, but I thought to do an umber sketch first because I consider value to be the foundation of any, the foundation of color, really. And so I was kind of overwhelmed by all the color in the setup. And so I thought that I should start with an umber sketch just to make sense out of what pretty quickly became a complicated setup. And also I thought it would be nice to illustrate kind of the I guess the different stages that I go through when I do a painting. I'll sometimes paint alla prima indirectly and we'll skip this stage, but found it really helped me to back up and isolate drawing value and then go in with color. So really at this point, I'm just using burnt umber. I start, I really in all drawing value color, I try and start simply before going to complicated things. And so the simplest breakdown of these objects is to find the terminator, like those sketches of the moon. Find the point at which light and shadow separate. And here I'm trying to create a simple binary of light and shadow. You can see on the subjects, it's not so obvious, but I've essentially tried to round up any part that's being hit by light to the light middle tone of the canvas. And then everything at certain planes, if they start to get more shadowy, I round down and I fill them in with this kind of ambient shadow tone. So really this calms my head. It helps me make sense of everything in the pictures by creating a simple binary of light and shadow. And that's something that definitely runs through academic schools of thought. That's sort of one thing that I really learned from studying, going back after art school and trying to learn from academic traditions. Like, how do they get such a great sense of form? And a lot of it is starting very simply. And because I have an open ground or an open tone, a wet tone, I can then expand that binary into 4 tones. So here you can see I'm putting a dark accent and I'm putting a light accent. And John Carlson, who wrote one of the great manuals for landscape painting, his assertion was that any scene, no matter how complicated, could be broken into 4 tones. So you see all these great painters who paint seemingly complicated subjects at a high level, and this reoccurring thread of just making things simple. So starting off with a value binary, then expanding into 4 values. And again, I think it's really at this stage that the feeling of solidity or light happens. And it's not something that will eventually, I want to sneak into the painting later. I found that any amount of embellishment, if I miss the basic sense of objects, tangible objects in space with a direction of light, if I don't insist on capturing that early on, it never happens. So I've learned the hard way that I need to consider that straight out of the gates. Color is a very rich subject. It's very complicated. And so I think that, historically, painters up until, I don't know, maybe the 18th century would probably think it was crazy to try and juggle drawing, value, color all at the same time, wet on wet. And so I think there's trying to at first just break off drawing value is very important before, juggle those balls before being bombarded with, the 8 more balls that color presents. And I do believe that value is the most important aspect of a color. Could be considered a separate thing, but really it's an aspect of a color. And we can sort of delve into any part of this, but a color has 3 qualities. It has a hue, it has chroma. So of course, hue is it red, is it yellow, is it blue? Chroma is how red, how yellow, how blue is it? Is it intense or is it grayed down? And then I feel like the most important aspect of color is the lightness or darkness. And I think part of if I do need to make a case for value, I would say that, a lot of mammals don't have great color senses and they navigate around the world just fine. Cats and dogs don't have a great color sense. On our branch of the evolutionary tree, color is it's a relative recent adaptation in our evolutionary history. I've heard one reason we might have developed it is to separate, ripe fruit from the background of jungle. So the red of an apple might blend in with the green of the leaves, but for color perception. So I don't mean this emphasis on value to undermine color, but I really feel like we could all, as artists, representational artists, find ways to focus on value, whether that's outsourcing it to a separate step in the process, or maybe doing some preliminary work before we start on a big ambitious painting. Just really sort out the values. And so here again, I'm working with a wet ground and using an additive brush for umber, and then using a subtractive brush to pull out the white of the canvas, or to herd the paint around and move it to where I want it.
If you were doing a portrait or a landscape plein air, you would follow this exact same process, wouldn't you?
Maybe not for a plein air, just because there's such a short time span, and oftentimes like the umber, if I need to do it in one sitting, the umber might muddy up the colors I subsequently put on top. But yeah, if it's something I'm going to spend 2 or 3 sittings on, if I'm disciplined, I would do kind of an umber sketch, or a layer of what might be called a dead color layer, like using a limited, like a Zorn palette, to do sort of a toned down version of the subject first. And again, I don't have a set procedure. I wing it. A lot of times I'll just go in and start washing on color to start with. But I do, even if I'm not technically isolating value, in my mind, I'm trying to do that. And I sometimes use, I carry around in my wallet this piece of red acetate. I'm not sure if anybody does this, but I have this little piece of red acetate. And when you look at the world through this, it just turns into shades of red. It sort of helps decipher the value. That's a little decoder that I have. And now I'm going into color. And color is a rich subject. I sort of arbitrarily decided to go into the yellow object first. And I've included my mixing space. I'll just say briefly, because some people might be curious about what colors I have out. I have titanium white. Can you see? You can't see my mouse cursor, can you?
We can. We see it moving.
Oh, you can.
We see
Okay.
it.
So titanium white. This is India yellow, which is kind of a new addition to my palette. I have mixed feelings about it, but it's nice. It's a nice sort of transparent yellow. It looks very orangey, but if anybody's used it, if you add it to white or use it transparently, it's just glowing, intense yellow. That isn't. It's warm yellow, but not orange as it appears. CAD yellow light. I have CAD red light. Here I have quinacridone rose, I think. I'll have that, or sometimes I use alizarin crimson. I have yellow ochre. Viridian, Ultramarine Blue, and Phthalo Blue. And so this is a limited, somewhat limited palette, but it's very versatile because you can capture like a broad range of color with it. And what I found is just historically, if I have a lot of earth tones on my palette, I will tend to make sort of brown paintings. And I had a teacher that when I was in art school said that I was just overusing brown. He said, you know, what's wrong with you? You've been indoctrinated with this old master aesthetic and all your paintings are brown. And so I've realized that because of my tendency to overuse it, I've sort of swiped them off my palette for years at a time because I just don't, you know, I'm apparently not, I don't have enough restraint to have it on my palette. So I remove my privileges, my earth tone privileges. And I like to derive my earth tones and my neutrals and grays from more pure ingredients. It makes me think more about those neutrals rather than defaulting straight to brown. So I'm starting to get sort of overwhelmed by all these strange, subtle value and color changes that are happening in that yellow object. And a lot of you probably painted lemons before, and they're a little confounding because when they get dark enough, they cease to become yellow. Like that shadow plane um, of that block will, you know, it's times appear brown and sort of warm. Other times it leans toward green. And so I'm trying to figure this out. This is sort of my initial block in, no pun intended. But you can see on the mixing space that I'm trying to structure my mixing space so that there is some kind of value gradient. Because even with the color, color can really distract from value. And so I found on my mixing space, I like to have some kind of organic but apparent value string where you can see the lighter yellows toward the top, trailing down to the richer middle tones, and then reserving a portion of the palette for the rich darks. It's not a system that I do in a very premeditated way. It's just I've learned to be mindful of it, and the hope is that my mixing space will have some semblance of order, meaning that it's not all blending into, you know, oil paint wants to mush to a uniform kind of gray. So I think it's important to stake out and designate certain parts of the palette for certain colors and values. And also, I don't like to mix a ton of little disparate puddles all over the palette because I find that ultimately your painting will end up looking like your palette. And if the palette's mushy and gray, you might notice that your painting is starting to look mushy and gray and sink into the middle tones. And conversely, if you have a bunch of little disparate puddles on your mixing space, your painting might be breaking apart, and you might not be able to see sort of the interrelation of all these parts. The harmony might be breaking apart. So that's my first stab at this. It was a little thing that I did where I just dragged the red into the background. I've heard that Sargent would oftentimes take a lit flesh tone and sort of paint it a quarter of an inch outside of the edge of the face, and then come in with maybe the darker, murkier background color, and then carve into that to reestablish the drawing. And that way there'd be a wet on wet sculpted edge rather than painting up to a line, stopping, painting up to a line and stopping. I forgot to readjust the angle of my camera when I did this block, but we'll still be able to see some of it. I think I'm sorry, I'm gonna snap out of this really quickly. Can you hold on a sec? I've got to pause this. Okay, I'm making sure that you all have seen that little insert, right, of the setup. I'm making sure that that's working. I'm going to resume this again. Oops, That's not what I want to show. Technical difficulties. Okay, you can see that all right, right?
We can mostly see what you're doing, so that's good.
Okay, good. Yeah, for a lot of this, I tried to put an insert of the setup so you could actually see what I was painting. I think I just took a break from it for this portion because it was obscuring what I was painting. But I found like one of the harder objects here was the white object. Again, I can't I don't have the benefit of just having, with the yellow and the red block, I know very obviously the local color manifests very strongly. So, it's like, oh, the red one, any shade of red's going to roughly do the trick. But with the white one requires really careful observation because it is changing very subtly, again, taking on the temperature of the ambience. I have to be very attuned to that. I think painting colors that are devoid of local color it's very important because you can really see what's happening on every object within the setup. And it also it hones one's sensitivity to grays. And I've heard people say that, the world is mainly composed of a symphony of grays. Most colors in nature are neutral. There are very few colors that do announce themselves in a very obvious way. Like, oh, that's red, or that's yellow, or that's teal. Oftentimes there's just a world of sort of inarticulable color. And so this developing one's sensitivity to the neutrals, I think is really important. The camera starts to get a bit blurry because this was as the day was winding down a bit. It was an overcast day, so I had this nice silvery light, but it was fading at this point, so the camera's getting a little blurry. But I did want to get the block in on the first sitting, my first initial pass. And I don't expect perfection on the first pass. I've taken a workshop with John Ebersberger, who's a great colorist, and he says that he usually does a block in, an initial block in, and then a second block in. Because really, until I see all my color choices in context, in concert with one another, it's very hard to tell if you're at all in the right range. I sort of benefited from having planned out the basic values of these planes, but really until I see it all together, color's such a relative thing, I don't know if I'm in the right ballpark yet. Actually, some of the colors that I struggled with the most were not the objects, but the background and the ground plane, those strange kind of mysterious grays. I think we all have the problem sometimes of getting our figures or subjects to look like they're part of a scene, and they harmonize with the background. The tendency is to look like the thing that we were focusing on is sort of superimposed on top of a on top of a background that doesn't relate. And so this is a good exercise in kind of sort of integrating the figure of the object into the ground. So here I've come back on the next day, and I'm trying to hone. The first thing I saw was that, a tendency of mine is that I tend to paint low contrast. And I think a lot of us have that tendency. I think it's, again, a problem with oil, an inherent problem that because of the slow drying time, or because of sort of not proper organization of the palette or our brushes or the surface we're working on, darks tend to get into the lights and muddy them up. And then white gets into the darks and chalks them up. So everything's sort of coming to the middle. One case I'll make for doing simple setups with planar objects like this is you can identify what your tendencies are and what your mistakes are, and learn from it in a simple, quick, very non-committal painting. Whereas, I found when I do this, I'm kind of shocked at how far off I am in places. and I'll identify a fundamental problem with the way I'm approaching things. Like for instance, if I notice that I just paint low contrast, or I come back to a painting of blocks and it looks like there's sort of this veil of murkiness over the whole thing, then I'll notice that that's probably what I've been doing with all my work for the last several years. And some of these weaknesses or biases we have can, in a very insidious way, kind of work themselves into all the work we're doing, and we won't even know it. But confronting the simple object and the simple setup, you'll realize like where the weaknesses in your game are and what you need to work on, and then it'll unlock something that'll take your other paintings to the next level. So I'm trying to add some more luminosity to this painting. I think I might have actually gone a little too light with some of these areas. And if we were painting more smoothly flowing volumes, it would be very hard to notice these very subtle temperature and value breaks between planes. But even on a smoothly flowing volumetric object, these things are still happening. These forces are still enacting on the block. So here, just having it be planar makes them more visible. There's really like a subtle iridescence to white objects, especially in daylight. And it can be, it's not the most glamorous exercise, but I find that I really get into it, and I start to see all these like beautiful little sort of moments of prismatic color in what otherwise would seem like sort of a drab setup. My friend Lisa Mitchell, who's a landscape painter, pointed out to me, for instance, she said, you never use purple. And then I realized, and hearing her say that and also painting blocks, I realized, I never use purple. And then I realized it was like colorblind to purple. And then I started looking around the world and starting to see purple everywhere. Purple's a very strange color, but it was a nice intervention on her part because sometimes we don't realize what our tendencies are, what our blind spots are. So I feel like painting this subject, you really get to know what your blind spots are. And the way I feel is that if I can't get light or volume to work on a simple object like this, I'm going to be way in over my head when I paint a figure, for instance, which is infinitely more complex. So I take the lessons that I learn in the setup and I extrapolate that out into my thinking when I paint landscapes or portraits. Any particular questions at this point?
Paul, you always tone your canvas before you start one of, this exercise or a portrait or anything. Is that correct?
I do like to have a tone down, just because I feel like working on stark white of the canvas, like it so alters my value perception. So I usually like a very light middle tone. It could be either be earth tone or some form of like gray. It helps me to just get a better hold on values. Um, I also find sometimes I get very intimidated by being confronted with a pristine kind of white surface, and it stifles me, and I get scared. Whereas sort of starting off by throwing down some chaos onto the picture in the form of tone or some texture sort of helps take it off that like pristine, like, pedestal. And then it makes it feel more like, okay, like this isn't so serious. At the end of the day, I'm pushing around colored mud, and let's just kind of push stuff around. you might see from like my my insect paintings and animals, I sometimes have like an obsessive tendency. I'm a little perfectionistic with drawing. So I've had to really struggle to become more, I guess, loose or more intuitive with paint. And so sometimes doing this subject that I know I'm not going into it expecting a great result. It's just a learning process. There's no illusion of doing something great, no aspiration to do something, polished. It just helps me really learn and not be afraid to try crazy things. So this demo is just another 8 minutes, and then I'm thinking we could kind of open up the floor to questions. And I can talk about color or value or drawing or whatever people feel, or how this relates to plein air, whatever people feel like talking about.
Alden, I'd like to know a little bit more about your own personal journey. Like, how did you decide that you would be an artist? What inspired you? I mean, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a good question. I the answer that I used to give was, my great aunt was a painter. She was an abstract expressionist who studied in New York in the 40s and 50s. And then she went on to have a very interesting life, traveled around the world, ended up living most of her life in Italy and France. And she was sort of the black sheep of the family, is my great aunt. And she had a huge influence on my father. So because of her, my father, traveled when he was a kid with her and sort of opened up the world to him, whereas he might have otherwise not have done that. And it sort of made, in his mind, an acceptable career choice to be an artist. And so my father always encouraged me, from a young age to pursue art. And I did study with my aunt a bit growing up. When I think further back, I had when I was a kid, my bedroom window faced a forest, and I remembered even as a kid just being very overwhelmed by the vastness and ancientness of the woods outside my window, especially at sort of dusk and at night when I hear the sort of the crickets in the forest, and it just seemed like this very great mystery um, that filled me with a sense of like longing and want to connect to that. And so growing up, I would take small pieces of nature. It could be like a dead bird on the porch or a root system of a tree, and very carefully try to record it in like graphite for the most part. And so sort of obsessively draw little pieces of nature, maybe in the hopes that I'd figure out some piece of this, big mystery that was nature. And so I guess my broader impulse to make art, I think, is that it's to connect to nature. I mean, again, this we could go on like tangents like this because it's kind of fun. But I was reading this or listening to a book on tape by a Scottish anthropologist. I think it was James Fraser, like one of the first anthropologists, 19th century Scotsman. And he did a survey of it was called the Golden Bough, a survey of religious or superstitious thinking in all cultures, sort of going back as far as he could. He just researched it extensively and found that there were a human constant are was this kind of magical thinking. Specifically, well, he broke it down into two main headers of magic. And one of them, I'm going to pause this for a sec because it's hard to concentrate while I'm looking at it. These two main headers of magic were contagious magic and mimetic magic. So mimetic magic in the mind of, I guess, like archaic cultures and people, which still exist today, there's a belief that things that look alike are supernaturally linked somehow. So an example of this that we all know is a voodoo doll. You make a sort of an effigy of a person, and what happens to the doll happens to the person. Contagious magic is the idea that things that are once in contact remain supernaturally in contact. And that could be an example of that would be, holding onto the lock of a deceased relative's hair because it was once part of them or once had contact with them. It's imbued with magical significance. Now, I was sort of listening to this book in a very detached way, like, oh, that's very interesting how those those archaic people thought. But then it really put into context art, because I'd wondered in my own practice, why have I devoted my life to like pushing around colored mud or like scraping marks on a surface to get it to look like a thing? It's a very strange thing to do. And it's a strange thing to devote one's life to. And I thought, well, I am making representations of things. And then this other aspect of my life or career that I couldn't figure out is why this insistence on painting from life. So I told you I have this insistence on being in the presence of the person, place, or thing that I'm painting. And at times I've thought, well, I think that's explained by contagious magic. The idea that I've been in the presence and been connected to the person, place, or thing, it sort of imbues the resulting painting with significance in my mind that is only explicable by some kind of, magical thinking. So one thing I've noticed that when I paint from life as opposed to photographs is, work that I do in the studio from a photograph, I might see it a couple years later and can't really remember anything about the story of that painting. But if I do, even in just an unsuccessful study outdoors, I can remember with like uncanny clarity where I was, who I was with, some of the sights and smells of that day, some of the backstory, the conversations I had with people on the way to the, while I was painting, if I was painting with a friend. And to me, that indicates that I'm really, present in those moments, which is something that for me, it's very hard to be present. And I tend to forget things because I tend to float through the world a bit. So, anyway, to give you a very deep sort of extensive answer of that, I think I'm performing some kind of primitive magic with painting. I think that's why I do it fundamentally. But yeah, it's also how I make my living and I like doing it. And my great aunt was a painter. That was more than you bargained for there with that question there, Patrick. Sorry.
I have more questions for you, but
Oh, please,
I feel
yeah.
like I'm monopolizing the time. Maybe there's someone, from the audience that would like to ask you something.
Yeah, I'm really open to talk about anything. Here you see, I'm just on a side note, I am putting some kind of finishing kind of flourishes on it. You see, I just took that a rigger brush, a very thin, small round, and I put that little cast shadow of the paper on the shadow box. So here I'm just kind of wrapping it up because I feel like I've basically caught the impression of what was happening there. I'm trying to go for smaller and smaller changes. One way I think about form is, like I said, start with the simplest. I try and start with the simplest arrangement, which is light and shadow. It's breaking the whole picture down into basic shapes. At a certain point, I make the transition from 2D world into 3D world where I'm thinking about forms. And again, thinking about form in the simplest way. And even now, I try to think about a figure as if I were sculpting it out of wood with a chainsaw. At first, only the largest planes, and subsequently then coming in with smaller chisels and increasingly small chisels to whittle away at smaller and smaller planes. And then at the end, if I choose, I can break out, sandpaper to sand down some edges or polish. So for me, that analogy of sculpting has really helped me step out of 2D world because especially when I was more just reliant on drawing, and I would say I've been a competent drawer for a while, and for many years, I think I leaned on that like a crutch. And I learned from the Betty Edwards drawing from the right side of the brain, which is all about sort of using angles and measurements and plumb lines to transcribe everything onto a flat surface. And that's very powerful and a great way of drawing. But I realized it's also like a flat-minded way of thinking, like abstract, flat-minded. And so my goal in the last maybe 10 years is to become more volumetric, sculpturally thinking. And so these planar objects have helped me kind of snap into a 3D mindset. So I'm trying to go for smaller and smaller, I guess, distinctions between values and colors. And this is the way it ended up. My palette's a little messy there. Wait, what am I doing here?
So we had a chat question, and I think you might have just covered the answer. But, any advice for applying this technique to painting the human face or hands?
Yeah, I'd say that there are some good resources for kind of planar breakdowns of the figure. I think that planar head is a pretty good tool. You'll find ones of varying sort of quality or accuracy, but I'm a big fan of painting that planar head. And there are some good instructional videos online. I know Stan Prokopenko he goes by Proko, does some good geometric breakdowns of the head. Andrew Loomis, the great illustrator, he has a very nice system of breaking down the head in sort of a cartoony geometric way. So I'd look up Andrew Loomis, Loomis. I've actually taken a couple sculpture classes with my friend Rick Casali, who teaches in Galesville, just south of Annapolis. His name is Rick Casali, Casali. And I actually bought his planar head. He sculpted. He has different lines of like planar heads that he casts in resin, and I bought one. So taking his class sort of helped me break down the simple, anatomy of the head. Again, it's important because before, when I'd done was again more in 2D mode, I could draw people competently and I could get likenesses, which I thought was really what all portraits were all about. But they were very drawn on. I'd be feature oriented: lashes, lid crease, iris, pupil, lower lash, nostrils. But the spaces in between the features have so much to do with likeness and the sculptural planes. And I really didn't understand them much at all. So I was coming up with somewhat competent renditions of likeness, but they weren't satisfying as I'd say works of art or paintings. So yeah, I would, Bridgman is a great resource, although a lot of his books are kind of disjointed and not they seem sort of very complicated. And I think that there's some like instructional tools. Yeah, I'd say the planar head is a great place to start. Did I answer that question? But for proportional systems, yeah, Andrew Loomis has a great breakdown of the face.
So Paul,
And
is it fair to say that, if you start with the simplest planes and then you start adding more and more planes, like micro planes within a plane, then the object that you're doing, a portrait or whatever, becomes more and more representational as you go. Is that fair to say?
yeah, I'd say so. That's one thing, just touch on the last thing I brought up was an interesting thing that Sargent apparently said to his students was, treat the head like a wig maker's block. So basically he was saying paint it like a planar head. And there are some paintings in progress that he left behind that sort of show that he really hacked it again, like out of like with a chainsaw, rather than sort of drawing in the features and then painting around the features. So that's about where it ended up. And The old blocks. So this concludes the block portion. I tried to stop the share. Did it work?
Yes, we see you.
Okay.
You're the main. We see you, not your screen now.
Okay, you can see my face. Okay. Well, I hope that was informative. I mean, I thought I purposefully left room for questions, so we can do questions and talk as long as you all like. Patrick, I don't think I gave you a satisfying answer to the last one.
Yes,
Yeah,
you did. You did. Thank
yeah,
you.
I mean, I guess maybe it's a problem with photos too. I think photos are so ubiquitous now. I think we're oftentimes striving to reach the kind of the perfection of a photograph. And I guess now cameras are a little bit different. You know, my phone has 3 lenses now, but still a photograph is kind of a flat image. The photo does the flattening out for us. And oftentimes, yeah, when we're working from a printout, we're just sort of copying, like replicating a 2-dimensional image. But we have 2 eyes because we have stereo vision. We've got 2 eyes that are constantly triangulating and deciphering form and everything. And I think older traditions sort of understood that. I mean, they were seeing things in a more sort of experiential way rather than sort of channeling reality through screens and printouts. So yeah, I guess I sort of went through a conversion, I guess, when I was about 30, where all of a sudden I was like, oh, I'm supposed to be painting like volume and sort of imbuing my pictures with a 3-dimensionality. Like that's been a big pursuit of painters through history, and I seem to be kind of divorced from it. Yeah, so any questions about anything, I'm totally open
Patrick, can
to.
we just talk right now, or do we have to type it in?
I think we're moving to just talking right now.
Okay.
That's good. It's a small enough group we can just, yeah, talk.
So I just wanted to ask about how do you deal with, when I look at something like your block setup, as I paint,
Mhm.
and I also like to paint from life, and I kind of actually struggle with photos. And the biggest reason for me is it eliminates a lot of the color that I see. But when I look at your blocks, if I was doing that from life, I see more and more and more pieces of color everywhere I see. So I start to break it down and down and down. And I wonder, do you experience that? And then do you just decide I'm going to keep it big shapes, or what do you do?
That's a really good question. So yeah, I think that the visual world, even in a simple, like what would you say, a controlled experiment with simple objects, it's still completely overwhelming. I think the bandwidth of our brain and our eye is very small, and it's very hard to see the whole picture. And I would say that working from life, a huge part of the difficulty is that vision is not static. As we look around the room, um, our pupil is constantly dilating and constricting, and our brain is constantly sort of white balancing and color balancing to take in a broader range of information than we should even include in the painting, um, based on what we've chosen to focus on. So I noticed that I tend to make shadows too light because when I look into the shadows, like a cat in the dark, you know, my pupil starts to dilate. I start to see more, like I'm essentially like shining a flashlight in the shadows, and I start making the shadows light. And then when I isolate 2 or 3 facets and zoom in on that, I'll see a broader color and value range in that small area than is necessary. And I think that I'm being like doing something really subtle and awesome, and I'm gonna get extra credit for nailing this relationship. But when I back off, inevitably everything's broken apart. And so oftentimes with color, like you really do have to, that's the benefit of standing back. And then sometimes it's hard in sort of a home environment where, or if you're sitting down, you're not always backing up. But I would say to counter that, you're always trying to like back up as far as you can. And if you're really looking into a color and you're starting to see every color in the rainbow,
Every
which is
color
essentially like not seeing,
especially.
which is essentially like not seeing any color at all. Like
Yeah.
I would encourage you to just blur your eyes, back up, see the whole thing, or bounce your eye to another disparate part of the picture that helps
Okay.
contextualize that color. Because value too and color is so relative. A huge benefit of a photo. Again, I'm not talking bad about photos, but photos do lock everything into a set value and color scheme for you, which is hugely advantageous. It just doesn't tell the whole story, but it's a satisfying breakdown. That's partially why it's so much easier to work from photos than from life.
Hmm.
Yeah, so that's a very good question. Painting from life is very confounding. Sometimes you need to back up and get less information than more.
Yeah.
And
I
that's
find
why
my
also
it's like my cones actually get kind of turned on. And there was a class that I took several years ago with Danny Dawson at the Torpedo Factory, and she would she's kind of the Henry Henchy school of thought. And when I would drive back home at the end of class, it was like my eyes were, I mean, everything was the most heightened color you could imagine everywhere I looked. They just had been way too excited, I guess, is what's going on.
That's
So anyway,
cool.
thank you. That was
Yeah.
a very helpful answer. Thank you.
Yeah, John Ebersberger is also from like the I guess the Cape Cod Henry Henchy school. He actually studied with Henchy, and it's a very, very interesting take because they don't like to reference value or sort of separate value from color. But yeah, they're probably more than any tradition that really tried to heighten sensitivity to color
Yep.
above all else.
Yes, you would
Sometimes
look for the greenest green you could get at different phases, or the bluest, whatever the bluest blue green, or what you would really hone in on a particular thing, and it was that's kind of what your eyes were doing, I suppose. Thank you.
One thing I'll say, since we're talking about the Henchy, this is important too to what you were talking about before. It is important to we are like painting is an interpretive process. We can't capture everything in nature because the limitations of colored mud. Painting the whitest white cannot emanate light the way like a cloud on a sunny day will like emanate light. So it is a necessary interpretation and lessening of what's going on in nature. I sometimes say it's like arranging a symphonic piece for a particular instrument, like arranging a symphonic piece for a guitar. You're going to have to make a lot of sacrifices in order to get the gist of it. You don't have like the full arsenal of instruments. You have to interpret it down. And I'd say also, while we're on the musical analogy, that what will help you to keep your painting from being all sorts of like disparate information that doesn't fit together is locking it into a key. The Henchy people talk about a color key or a value key. And I think that's a musical analogy. You have to decide what key the piece is in. If it's in C, every note that you put in has to be harmonious according to that system. And anything that is anomalous will just be discordant. It'll sound wrong. So you do, this is not just a perceptual exercise. It is conceptual. I at a certain point found that hard to admit because I was a perceptual purist. I'm like, I'm not going to put anything in my painting that I haven't like seen because that's cheating. And, that's, that's not real. But I've realized that we do need conceptual frameworks like snow falling on rock faces. It's an analogy for light. And if you think of, you're seeing, but thinking in that way and overlaying those different interpretive lenses will help sort of corroborate at the end of the day the same story. And you need to stick with a story rather than get distracted by every piece of visual information.
Thank you.
Palden, can I ask a bit more about your personal practice of art? I mean, I know you teach at Micah, you teach at the Zoll studio. Like, is your time sort of split, like commissions half the time, teaching half the time, taking care of the kids the third half of the time? How do you structure your life?
Yeah, that's something that I haven't figured out. I don't manage my time or my career very well. I do I would say split sort of my time with work between, painting and teaching, maybe 50-50. I teach at Micah one day a week. a mastering painting class currently. I'm teaching 1 day a week at Zoll. And then my work sort of takes me in different directions. I currently have, I just finished up that portrait commission of the lady with the two dachshunds. There's going to be they're having like an informal unveiling at their house next week. So hopefully I'll get some more business from that. I should say that that commission was done almost exclusively from photographs because she didn't have time to sit. The dogs didn't have time to sit. The dogs would not sit. They would not cooperate. And I understood that going into it. So, you know, if people are thinking that I'm poo-pooing photography too much, that is necessary for portrait commissions in my mind. Things just kind of happen. You know, I'll do a couple plein air events a year. I was painting on a property that I thought was particularly beautiful earlier this year or last year, and a car pulled over behind my car, and I thought they were telling me to move along, but apparently it was the owner of the property, and on the spot she commissioned like a big mantelpiece painting. So um, my career sort of takes me in different directions at the expense of my I guess branding. I think there's some people that are very smart about just doing one thing really well or a couple things really well, whereas I am like, I'm a lifelong student and I'm always going to try and find out about this, and then I'm going to try and find out about that. So it's hard being an artist. I think you have to create some kind of arbitrary structure to your day and whatnot, but I haven't really figured it out.
I bet you will figure it out. You sound like you figured it out.
Thank you. Glad I sound like I know what I'm doing.
Very humble, isn't it?
Right, he can hear you. I have a question.
Sure.
Hi, Palden, I'm
Hi.
a big fan, and I've been following you on Instagram, I guess, for a while, and there was that portrait you did of the woman in the striped dress that I think made one of the magazines. I don't know if it was Connoisseur or
Oh, was that
Art
recently?
something.
Oh,
Within the
was it?
last year or two, yeah.
Okay. So it wasn't like a month ago. It was,
No.
was it kind of
Unless it
surreal?
did
Like,
again.
were there like blue dots, kind of like,
Maybe.
I'm
Yeah,
trying to
it
think
was
of
like a blue striped dress, and
yes.
the warm and the cool hit with the dress, which was the question I was going to ask about your work was, when do you add temperature?
That's
to
a
your
really good question.
subjects?
Yeah, you know, I said with value, it's really helpful to create a simple binary. So always start off with like in the simplest way, which is like take a thing and divide it into two. Warm and cool, I guess, would be the fundamental uh, binary in terms of color. Warm and cool. I tend to think more in terms of primaries, I guess. I found that that's helpful, just red, yellow, blue, and then just, you know, like I said, deriving my neutrals from that and thinking, you know, when I look at skin tones, a lot of times it's like, what color is that? Am I colorblind? I can't see skin tones. So it helps for me to ask the question, does it lean toward yellow, or does it lean toward red, or does it lean toward blue? But another way of thinking about it would be, you know, does it lean toward warm, or does it lean toward cool? I think that's a really helpful distinction. You know, I find in most setups, I was talking about conceptual overlays that help you make sense and lock the whole picture into a single key. You can oftentimes indoors, like in my studio, the light from either the blue sky coming in the north facing skylight, or on an overcast day, there's sort of a silvery coolness to that powder that's depositing down on objects. And conversely, the shadows appear a little bit warmer. I don't know whether that's like factually true, but I think it has to do with the way we perceive things. Our eyes always kind of light balancing, trying to create contrast. And one way that our eye and our mind creates contrast is between warm and cool. So when a cool light will tend to make shadows look warmer. Conversely, a lot of times when you have a clip light, warm light, shadows do look blue or purple sort of by comparison. And so I think that's a good kind of starting point for, you know, harmonizing a painting. I've seen like my friend Tim Bell, who's a great landscape painter who lives in Easton and kind of, you know, always has an incredible showing at Plein Air Easton. he starts by, he's known for doing these rather large, complicated, ambitious paintings of like, skipjacks in a boatyard at the last 15 minutes of light in the day, like raking warm light.
Mhm.
And he starts off by creating a warm cool binary, usually a yellow purple. So everywhere that late afternoon, that fiery late afternoon light's hitting, he washes with like yellow or orange, like yellow. Everything that is outside the influence of that primary light source is like kind of purple or blue because it's being
In
sort of
shadow.
illuminated in a darker way by sort of the blue dome of the sky.
Mm.
And so whether it's a boathouse or a boat or the water or the dock, everything is abiding by that warm, cool dichotomy. And then he starts putting notes in that sort of complicate it a little bit more. But at the end of the painting, you can see it pops. So yeah, warm cool is a very helpful way of seeing and also kind of thinking about imbuing that into the painting.
And any background about this woman, this figure in the blue and white dress?
Yeah, that was kind of a strange painting. That was kind of an experimental painting. I started it from life. I have a lot of kind of half-finished figure paintings from sessions around my studio. And because I am very perceptual and I'm almost too attached from painting from life. I think that maybe my creative side or my memory has sort of atrophied a bit. And so I'll sometimes go into these paintings that I have lying around the studio and try and make them interesting. And that was like one such experiment. I'm like, what can I do from memory? That painting's a little surreal. So I ended up just taking like dollops of like oiled down phthalo blue, and I made sort of like, I kind of like designed this dress for her by like dotting blue on,
Oh, wow.
and it ended up being kind of this strange painting. I called it debutante. She was in this very kind of classical pose.
Yeah.
And she almost looked like I'd scraped off the painting and sanded it and repainted it so many times. The texture of her skin almost looked like kind of like peeling paint. Like the whole painting looked like kind of the weathered facade of some like ancient building or something. So I just let that kind of steer the
I
narrative. I
think I
put some kind of
like that.
crumbling.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was more imaginative. I mean, I can tell from the work behind you that you've got like, conceptual sort of like, lean. And I think that's where I sometimes feel like I need to go.
You still have this painting that Susan's been talking about?
I'm gonna bring it, see if I can
think
bring it.
did it win an award or something? I mean, it had a big spread in this magazine, and I think there was a biography of you in it.
I think it was featured in Fine Art Connoisseur.
Fine, yeah, connoisseur. That's what I think.
I'll
About
see
a
if
year
I can.
ago, a year and a half ago, something like that.
Oh, I wish my website worked. That would be nice. I'll see if I can find it really quickly in my reproductions because I did like that painting. Um,
How big was that painting?
it was about 2 by 3 feet, maybe a little bigger than that. Okay, I think I found it. At least a small version of it.
There's 40 inches on Instagram.
Oh, you found it, Lisa?
Yeah, it's on his Instagram account.
Well, he's found
Okay,
it.
That's it. That's it.
someone-
I thought that was so imaginative.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I need to use my imagination a bit more. I showed it in my personal work that I showed earlier. I showed some of my like lunch notes I do for the girls and kind of like my whimsical like dioramas and stuff. So I swear I'm creative. I have a creative side. I think I need to let it come out more in my paintings. But yeah, that was mostly kind of from just imagination, I'd say, outside of the head and the hands.
Yeah, I thought she had a short haircut.
And then also kind of playing with color harmonies, not necessarily just in service of replicating what I see, but just kind of thinking like, well, what looks good? What aesthetically is pleasing? Sorry, Patrick.
She was like a nude that you put a blouse on.
Yeah, I was gonna ask
exactly.
that. Did
Yeah,
this
she was
start
nude.
out as a nude?
It was a nude. And And I have a lot of paintings from open figure sessions where, it's really hard to put any kind of context in a painting of a nude because it just looks like, a nude sitting on a stool in a studio somewhere. And so sometimes I try and put clothes on or do things like that.
Is this still in your possession, or did you end up selling this to someone?
This one sold. Actually, it got a good response. And sold to a lady in Atlanta. And yeah, I have a whole bunch of work in my studio that is kind of almost has a symbolist type look to it. Kind of strange figures, but they're all sort of half done. I'm trying to be more attuned to my inner world. I think I've devoted so much of my life and career to being in a very materialist way, not like a materialistic, like I love to go shopping, but materialist. I see the world as in a very scientific way where, reality is external and it abides by the rules of physics and matter. And I don't think enough about my inner world. And so now I've maybe I'm getting a little woo-woo-y in my like middle age, but I'm trying to be more attuned to my dreams and yeah, that's sort of like maybe collective subconscious and trying to bring up some aspects of that and imbue it in my work. So going forward, I'm going to be toying with that more.
Well, Palden, you've been with us generously for an hour and a half now. Thank you. Thank you for supporting the Rockville Art League, and just thank you for your vision. It's just wonderful. Any last questions before we wrap up tonight? Anybody out there?
Yeah,
No,
I
I
should say
just have a
thanks for having me, and thanks for your time and attention. Like I'm honored that you hung in there. and whoever was talking, please continue.
Oh, I just wanted to comment on your little painting in the International Artist last month too. That
Hi,
was
Karen.
wonderful. Hi.
Oh. Thank you so much.
I
Yeah,
enjoyed.
I actually talked a little
was
bit about that girl in
yeah,
the write-up. I think I
yes.
overshared about the process. That was a painting that I did from life, and I painted that model so many times, and I've failed so many times. I think I was just kind of like I was intimidated by painting this particular model, but one of them, I felt like that one turned out, which I was really happy with.
Yes. Beautiful painting.
Thank
Well,
you.
well, Palden, thank you so much again. I hope that in the future we'll hear more from you, and I'm already following you, and I have one of my personal resolutions is to try to get up to Baltimore to take one of your classes, but
I'm here whenever you need me. No
yet,
rush.
but the year is only 1 month in, so that'll be great. And
Yeah,
thank you all for joining in. And with that said, this ends our Zoom. Thank you again.
Oh, my cat might make an appearance. Hold on.
Uh-oh.
That's my cat. Yeah, I was kind of surprised she didn't make an appearance.
At least 16 years old, right?
Anyway, okay, well, it was great seeing you all.
Thank
Patrick.
you.
Thank you, Lisa.
Bye.
All right, bye now.
Thank you, Patrick.